People say things like science is about how and theology is about why. That's just much too simplistic. Darwinism and Catholic doctrine just cannot both be true. My talk is not going to be of the scientific kind. We've had an excellent presentation this morning already and also last night, but I will try to force people to think about science and our faith to see how intelligent design is really very much connected. It's not in a parallel kind of universe. And I'm going to use the topic of original sin to do it. And I hope that it'll become clear towards the end how many points can really be dealt with by looking at original sin. So I begin with a slide from the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Original sin remains an essential truth of the faith. I want to just put that there, that it is still part of the Catechism. A lot of people would like to deny original sin, but it's still there, and it's not just some subsidiary truth, but an essential truth of the faith. And why is that? Well, I think that we need original sin to make sense out of why there is evil in creation. People ask themselves the question, if God is all powerful and all good, why is there evil in creation? And we see that there is physical evil. We see diseases, earthquakes, and hurricanes, and there is certainly moral evil. We do really nasty things to one another and have been doing so ever since the beginning of history. And of course, the one certainty of our life here is that we will all have to die. So why, if God is all good and all powerful? So the church's answer is Adam and Eve, that they rebelled against God and that we live in a fallen world. But moderns find this difficult to accept in light of the current creation myth, the Darwinian propaganda, that claims that science knows that we descended by a slow, gradual process from some group of primates. This was really brought home to me several years ago. One of the catechists in our parish came to me and said, "Father, I've been teaching the children about Adam and Eve, but you can tell me, what's the real story?" So I figured, okay, maybe I should actually sit down and write a book about it. So I have actually done that. But I will just use the topic of original sin in this particular lecture. So we are going to start by discussing Occam's razor. If you don't know too much science, you might think that Occam's razor favors the Darwinian account. Well, sort of. And why does Occam's razor do that? Well, Occam's razor, I think many of you know, most of you know, is that it basically, if there's two explanations, choose the simpler one. Don't multiply explanatory entities. Keep to the simple, the clear process. So Occam's razor sort of wins against the Catholic account because it links together, makes into one, the creation of man and his fall. And why so? Well, what kind of a being would be favored by natural selection? Well, obviously beings that copulate often because they produce lots of offspring. Beings that are violent. Certainly, it's advantageous to strike first rather than to be killed. Creatures that hoard things so that they can survive a famine or something or other natural calamity. So it makes sense why we are lustful and violent and greedy and all the other things that we associate with original sin. The Darwinian story comes with its own explanation of why we suffer from these sinful tendencies. It is a one-step process. Now, the Christian account is a two-step process. God created us in his image, and then we rebelled against him. So since simplicity favors Darwin's account, Occam's criterion would win. But that is only if Darwinian evolution could actually explain the arrival of a human being, the arrival of life, and we've seen, I think, quite convincingly this morning that it falls considerably short. And just to quote one sort of scientific study when it comes to human beings, fairly recently there was a meta-study of papers about human evolution, and the study was summarized in this way by the American Museum of Natural History. It said, most human origin stories are not compatible with known fossils. The number of species in the human family tree has exploded, but so has the level of dispute concerning early human evolution. However, many of these fossils show mosaic combinations of features that do not match the expectations for ancient representatives of the modern ape and human lineages. As a consequence, there is no scientific consensus on the evolutionary role played by these fossil apes. Overall, the researchers found that most stories of human origin are not compatible with the fossils that we have today. The lead researcher for the paper admitted, when you look at the narrative for hominin origins, it's just a big mess. There's no consensus whatsoever. Now, that we've dismissed at least that part of the argument for Occam's razor. Let's take a look at the Catholic teaching on the fall of man. And again, this is from the Catechism. And it tells us that the account in Genesis 3 uses figurative language, but it affirms a primeval event, a deed that took place at the beginning of human history. Revelation gives us the certainty of faith that the whole of human history is marked by the original fault committed by our first parents. And there's a footnote there, and it cites three things. And these are three teachings that are quite authoritative. The first is the most, but the other ones I include because they are post-Darwin. So first of all, in the Council of Trent, 16th century, it speaks about the sin of Adam, which is one in origin. So we all inherit original sin from one person. And then Pius XII, who in 1950, in his encyclical Humani Generis, permitted the discussion of the possibility of the evolution of the human body, nevertheless said that that does not pertain to the soul, that God must be the immediate cause of each human soul, because it is a spiritual entity which cannot be produced by mixing matter in any sort of way, no matter how complicated. And then he specifically addressed the possibility that we come from more than one person. And so he says, the faithful cannot embrace that opinion which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth true men who did not take their origins through natural generation from him as from the first parent of all, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents. Now, it is in no way apparent how such an opinion can be reconciled with that which the sources of revealed truth and the documents of the teaching authority of the Church propose with regard to original sin, which proceeds from a sin actually committed by an individual Adam, and which, through generation, is passed on to all, and is in everyone as his own. So Pius XII is still insisting on monogenism, just like the Council of Trent. We all come from a sole, single mother and father. And that's contrasted with polygenism, and that just means that there's more than one. Some people look at polygenism as speaking about different groups of primates in different parts of the world giving rise to different races. Well, that is a form of polygenism, but it could also mean that there was an original pack of 100 primates that all sort of gave rise to us. That too is polygenism because it's more than just the one couple. And then Paul VI, speaking in the 1960s, that's the third footnote, it is evident that you will not consider as reconcilable with the authentic Catholic doctrine those explanations of original sin given by some modern authors that start with the presupposition of polygenism, which is not proved. So he was chastising some theologians who just immediately assumed that evolution happened because we were allowed to talk about it, and started coming up with also scenarios that had the possibility of polygenism. So who are these Catholics who favor evolution? Well, the most famous of them all is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was not really a Darwinist. It was sort of more German Naturphilosophie, as in sort of a vision of the universe evolving into consciousness and evolving eventually into the omega point, which at some point he equated with God, at some points he was ambiguous about. But he was a very influential man. In his youth, he was involved with the discovery of Piltdown Man. Are people familiar with Piltdown Man? So some are, some aren't. Piltdown Man was a supposed missing link that came to light in the years during the First World War. It was the cranium of a modern human being and the jaw of an orangutan, and it was displayed in the British Museum of Natural History until 1953. It was the subject of literally hundreds of PhD studies before it was revealed that it was a complete forgery. And obviously, at that point, well, it was removed. Whether Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was knowingly culpable or not, that's an open question. The second thing is he was the discovery of something called Peking Man, which is supposed to be another missing link, which many people now in the field just think it's just a modern human being. And throughout his whole life, there were many acts of disobedience to the church's authorities. They started off with his lectures in Belgium in 1922. He started talking about human origins, and he, at that point, cast doubt on the Garden of Eden and proposed a redefinition of original sin. So his superiors ordered him to sign a declaration disavowing these propositions and to correct the lecture, which the superior then sent to Rome along with Teilhard's signed retraction. While waiting for a response from Rome, Teilhard kept developing his controversial theses on original sin. As a result, Father Ledowkowski, the superior general of the Jesuits, ordered him to sign a further declaration disavowing the controversial theories, and he also forbade him from giving any more lectures at the Institut Catholique. Teilhard was not one to give up. He kept on asking for permission to have various of his publications, various of his books published, and kept on being told no, and we've told you no already, and no, and now you can't even have your office in this building anymore. But in 1955 he died, and he, contrary to his vow of poverty, made a will that gave the text of the phenomenon of man to secular publishing houses that were not bound by the church rules. And so the phenomenon of man came out in 1955, got translated into English in 1959, and finally in 1962 church authorities just issued a monitum, a warning on all his works. But that didn't stop the enthusiasm for Teilhard. And in particular, he addressed original sin in an appendix to this book. But he wrote this appendix back in 1948 when he couldn't publish it. And he says, "True, evil has hitherto not been mentioned, at least explicitly. But on the other hand, it inevitably seeps out of every nook and cranny through every joint and sinew of the system in which I have taken my stand. So where does it come from? On this question, in all loyalty, I do not feel I am in a position to take a stand. In any case, would this be the place to do so? Well, I think that's kind of sad, because original sin is an essential teaching of the church. So if you're going to be a Catholic priest, you have to find a place for it. You can't write about pie in the sky theories with no reference to it, with no thought of how it connects. And yet that's exactly what we get in Teilhard. Some people liked him a lot. Henri de Lubac, for example, was a Jesuit and was a friend, but might find it surprising, but there were even aspects of Teilhard that Pope Benedict could refer to in a positive light. But I don't particularly like Teilhard, as you can tell, and so I'm more of Gilson's opinion, who wrote a letter to Teilhard, to Henri de Lubac, in fact, a series of letters on this. He said, "You can't get any benefit or enlightenment from thinking about Teilhard. The ravages that he has wrought, that I have witnessed, are horrifying. I do everything I can to avoid to talk about him. They use him like a siege engine to undermine the church from within. I'm not kidding. And I, for one, want no part of this destructive theme." I'll continue with this letter. What worries me is rather that while our Christian theologians, starting with your allegorists, developed their theologies from meditations on the scriptures, Teilhard, grounded in his evolutionary consciousness, built his theology from a meditation on science. Thus, it amazes me when people stick his Pauline sayings about the cosmic and evolving Christ on the bulletin board, because if sin and grace are not the very foundations of the epistles to the Romans, I don't know anything about St. Paul. Now, Gilson met Teilhard on 2 occasions, and I'll detail both of them because they do show this complex human being that I think has done a tremendous amount of damage, but it shows you, I think, what you get when you don't combine the truths that God has revealed and your own ideas. And so the first time that Gilson met Teilhard, Gilson was the godfather of a child that Teilhard was baptizing. He was very impressed by Teilhard's exercise of his priestly ministry on that occasion. Now, the second time that he met him was at a conference in New York in 1954, which was just a year before Teilhard's death. He writes, "We hadn't had much to say to each other except naturally for the usual small talk. In our first encounter, though, Father dealt me a 1-2 punch that left me reeling for 3 days afterwards. I never regained my poise. As soon as he spotted me, he strode straight up, his pleasant, handsome face lit by a smile, and clasping his hands on my shoulders, he said to me point blank, 'Hey, can you tell me if anyone is ever going to give us a scoop on this religionless Christianity we've all been waiting to hear about?' The neologism at this point was meta-Christianisme, so meta-Christianity. Gilson continues, taken aback, I sputtered a bit, finally managing to make an awkward joke, of which I think the sense was that I already had enough to do to get a grip on the plain Christianity. And so we left it at that. Later on, Gilson passed by Teilhard and saw that this priest was now engrossed in his breviary. So it's clear that Teilhard was clearly an enigma, and I think a dangerous enigma. Now, another dangerous ex-priest, and I can go through this quickly because somebody asked a question about this very thing. Francisco Ayala was a Dominican. He was ordained to the priesthood in 1960, left the same year, and then left the church completely. And obviously got very keen on evolutionary biology, proponent of Darwin. And by the early 2000s, he didn't even want to answer the question as to whether he was a religious believer or not. He won the Templeton Prize, which obviously should show some respect for religion, but he said, I don't want to be tagged by one side or the other, so he's not going to answer. Anyways, one of the things that he, in the 1990s, came up with was the idea that, well, there's too much genetic variation in the human race for it to have originated from two people. And this is where Anne Gauger did studies to see how much truth there was to this. And she says, it comes to the conclusion, you can read about it in this Discovery Institute Press book, but one thing is now clear: Adam and Eve have not been disproven by science, and those who claim otherwise are misrepresenting the scientific evidence. There's more on exactly how far back we have to go. Anne Gauger and then others after her thought that you can get the genetic variation that we find among ourselves now from a single couple 500,000 years ago, but we don't need to get into those details. But even the people that were touting Ayala's claims as proof of Darwinian evolution and of a scenario where the representatives of the human race were never fewer than 10,000, recognized their mistake and admitted it. So I just wanted to clear that off the board. Then I come to Christopher Baglow's book. The reason I pick on this is I thought, hey, this might make a nice textbook for the philosophy of science course that I'm teaching at the seminary, put out by a reputable publisher, Midwest Theological Forum. They do a lot of good books. Well, I started reading it and my blood pressure started to go up. So it was not very good even on the physics section. And then we got to evolutionary biology, and then it became really bad. So Baglow tells us that the church never condemned either the idea of evolution or the Darwinian theory of it, and Catholics have always been free to accept or reject it. Well, several years before this edition, the second edition of Baglow's book came out, Michael Haberek, a Dominican priest, published a book called Catholicism and Evolution, an excellent book that has basically all the teachings and even the private investigations of some Catholic theologians. And he tells us, actually this is my summary of his teaching, he says that the church, aware of the bad press of the Galileo affair, chose not to make any great public pronouncements apart from the Council of German Bishops meeting in Cologne in 1860, which condemned Darwin's theory. But behind the scenes and quietly, the church, through various organs, silenced the enthusiasm of some of her children for evolutionary theory. And in particular, there's Raffaello Caverni, Dalmas Leroy, John Zam, Henri Dorledeau, who were all priests who had argued for what is today called theistic evolution. They're told, no, you can't publish that. No, you can't go to this conference. No, we don't trust you on this. And then, of course, there is Teilhard de Chardin, who was condemned quite a few times. And just to bring that up to date, and Haberek actually mentions it as well, it's John Paul II's address to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences in October 1996, which many people thought was a carte blanche to accept Darwinism, but not if you read it carefully. And there, the Holy Pontiff tells us the theories of evolution, which because of the philosophies which inspire them, regard the spirit either as emerging from the forces of living matter or as a simple epiphenomenon of that matter, are incompatible with the truth about man. So that makes it clear, I think, that Darwinian evolution is not compatible with the truth about man. And Baglow's book, we're told, While many religious people accepted Darwin's theory of evolution, there were many who did not. Indeed, there are many Christians today who bitterly oppose Darwinian evolution. As we have seen, some of them think that it is contrary to the book of Genesis. Others have theological or philosophical objections to it. Conveniently not mentioned are those of us who oppose Darwin's theory on scientific grounds. The scientific problems are, of course, enormous, and they will not go away. But Baglow just doesn't recognize that there's anybody speaking against it. He just thinks that there's a uniquely converging tree of life. That's completely wrong. That DNA, he says, is the blueprint for life. No. And then there are many other scientific errors that we need not go into. Well, except we will. And that is that he's inspired by another Catholic evolutionist, Kenneth Miller, to explain why the brain is responsible for so much confusion. He says, the circuitry of the brain is in fact a poorly integrated mixture of the truly ancient, the very old, and the relatively new, all working side by side. Baglow then draws his own conclusion. In summary, despite being one of the great wonders that evolution produced, our biological and neurological inheritance has its shortcomings. This explains a great deal about why humans act irrationally and contrary to goodness, why racism and other forms of bias seem to crop up throughout history, why male human beings find it so hard to treat women as equals and not as objects, and why wars and the killings of the innocent are constants in human history. There's nothing from the scientific perspective that should make us surprised by this. So it seems to me that the vagaries of evolution are temporarily patched up by the band-aids of grace. So we have this badly designed creature that sort of just walked its way into some form of consciousness, had some band-aids of grace to put him in the Garden of Eden, and then immediately he loses these band-aids and where he's back down to the vicious creature that evolution made him out to be. Now, to focus next on Kenneth Miller, where he got this, where Baglow copied from her. I mean, he did attribute it, so I'm not accusing him of plagiarism. But Kenneth Miller, in his book Finding Darwin's God, writes, "No question about it, rewind that tape of evolution, let it run again, and events might come out differently at every turn. Surely this means that mankind's appearance on this planet was not preordained, that we are here not as the product of an inevitable procession of evolutionary success, but as an afterthought, a minor detail, a happenstance in a history that might just as well have left us out." I agree. And so the big question, do we have to assume that from the beginning God planned intelligence and consciousness to develop in a bunch of nearly hairless bipedal African primates? If another group of animals had evolved to self-awareness, if another creature had shown itself worthy of a soul, can we really say for certain that God would have been less than pleased with his new Eve and Adam? I don't think so. Well, my question in this, what happens to divine omniscience with a theory with a scenario like that? And what is the soul doing if this ape could have self-consciousness? That's what we usually think that the human soul does for us. So I'm not quite sure what Kenneth Miller thinks that we're plopping into this creature that's just getting off its knuckles to make it into a human being. Enough of Ken Miller, and now to the Thomistic Evolution Project. This is a picture of the first edition of the book called Thomistic Evolution, and the project describes itself on the back of the book. Thomistic Evolution is a team of Dominican friar scholars committed to the preaching of the gospel and through the Thomistic intellectual tradition, providing answers to questions about faith and reason and religion and science. Now, in the 2016 edition, we have Father Austriaco, Nicanor Austriaco, trying to make it possible for Catholics to hold on to polygenism, at least denying monogenism. And he quotes an international theological commission, which was at that time presided over by Cardinal Ratzinger, which stated, Catholic theology affirms that the emergence of the first members of the human species, whether as individuals or in populations, represents an event that is not susceptible of a purely natural explanation and which can appropriately be attributed to divine intervention. Now, according to Austriaco, this suggests that both monogenism and polygenism can remain viable theological opinions for Catholic theologians seeking to be faithful to the doctrinal tradition. And again, he specifically appeals to Ayala's claim that we were never a group of fewer than 10,000 individuals that gave rise to who we are. Now, one can, at that point, when I was just aware of the 2016 book, I was thinking, well, okay, let's see how he's going to put original sin into it. But then I got bored because he changed his mind. He's now into monogenism, but the very, very strange sort. So I looked up the 2019 edition, and we get this. And I think it's worth quoting him at length because there are just so many problems with it. So he now has adopted monogenism, but this is how it occurred. This critical point in evolutionary history occurred about 100,000 years ago in Africa among a group of anatomically modern human beings when an individual hominin was conceived with the inherent neurocognitive capacity for language. How exactly this occurred will always be a matter of speculation. As Noam Chomsky has proposed, a single mutation acquired at conception could have altered the structure of an individual anatomical modern human's brain in a way that gave him the capacity for language. In my view, for reasons I cannot develop at this time, this capacity for language would have gone hand in hand with the capacity for abstract thought. As the first speaking primate, this individual would also have been the first rational animal. He was the first anatomically modern human to have the capacity to form abstract concepts, to reason, and therefore to construct an internal map of his world. As he matured, he would have used this linguistic ability to speak to himself and to God. This first speaking human is the original human we call Adam. Moreover, since every human being today possesses the same linguistic capacity, each one of us must have inherited that capacity from him. Each one of us must therefore be descended from this first speaking human. Adam would not only have been the first speaking human, he is also the father of all speaking humans, which is all of us. So we have a new Adam understood in a new kind of way. Now, I think that we have several problems here. First of all, a single mutation in DNA is credited with giving us the ability to reason and speak. And I think from what Dr. Miller said this morning, that is just not going to happen. This is an absurdly tall order for a single genetic mutation. After all, the capacity for language and abstract thought is qualitatively one of the biggest leaps forward in the history of life, arguably as big as the origin of the first life and the origin of consciousness in the first animals. And here we're supposed to believe that a single mutation to a strand of DNA produced it. It flies in the face of common sense. It also presents a fitness problem. Before this magical mutation, the human form would be roughly as weak as it is now. But without our intelligence and capacity for speech, such relatively weak and unintelligent animals would not survive long in a dog-eat-dog world. And I think that perhaps ties into a question that was asked about pre-rational human beings. I mean, we are pretty pathetic without an intellect. We're slow, we're weak, we don't have much fur to protect us. It would be a disaster for us to be put into this earth without an intellect. Anyways, there's more problems with Austriaco. What does Austriaco's new scenario do to the need for a spiritual soul? That's the same kind of problem as we saw in Kenneth Miller. Next, philosophers of language usually take Wittgenstein's argument against a private language seriously. Now, why would this lucky primate ever think to develop a language, especially since no one else would be around to speak to? And what about his mute pre-rational mate, rather? What happens to all the rich theology of the body that draws its inspiration from the creation of Eve from the side of Adam? If Adam had to wait for a child to come along before he could experience a truly human relationship, one would hardly blame him for thinking that existence was a burden and for turning his back onto God. So I really find it depressing to see that a Catholic theologian who specializes in the interaction of faith and science should be so easily swayed by the latest speculations from science as to keep rewriting the very important theology of our origin and fall. And to be even more critical, Chomsky's surmise had been around for quite some time and was showing its age. Why pick it up in 2019, 5 years after a paper in which Chomsky and several other experts in language basically said that they had no clue where human language originated from? So let's go back to the real Thomas. And this is another point I think that we should keep in mind. If you go to the Summa Theologiae, Prima Pars, question 94, Article 3, there Thomas describes the first human being. And he says, now, man can be the principle of another man not only by generation of the body, but also by instruction and government. Hence, as the first man was produced in his perfect state as regards his body, for the work of generation, so also was his soul established in a perfect state to instruct and govern others. I think that St. Thomas's conception of the first man illustrates an important truth about original sin. Adam was truly guilty of sin because God had given him the capabilities and the freedom to resist the serpent's temptation. He wasn't a powerless reed blown about by the wind. But imagine instead if we think in Darwinian terms of Adam as the descendant of an evolving primate, grunting its way to self-consciousness, and then finally with Adam crossing some barely perceptible line. It would be, I think, an insult to divine justice to maintain that death and all sorts of other evils are the proper punishment for such a pathetic creature's misdeed. All the more so when we reflect that the process of natural selection would have primed man to be grasping, opportunistic, lustful, self-seeking, etc. But that is the Darwinian picture, not the biblical one. To safeguard God's justice, Adam needed to be fully aware of what he was doing and fully equipped to meet and resist the temptation if he chose. And according to St. Thomas in the passage above, Adam was so equipped. Now let's move over to the wider consequences of the fall. Again, back to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. In paragraph 400 we read, the harmony in which they had found themselves, thanks to original justice, is now destroyed. The control of the soul's spiritual faculties over the body is shattered. The union of man and woman become subject to tension, their relations henceforth marked by lust and domination. Harmony with creation is broken. Visible creation has become alien and hostile to man. Because of man, creation is now subject to its bondage to decay. And finally, the consequence explicitly foretold for this disobedience will come true. Man will return to the ground, for out of it he was taken. So death makes its entrance into human history. Now, the footnote is to Romans 8 that speaks about the whole of creation waits with eager longing for the revelation of the sons of God, for the creation was subject to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of him who subjected it. So it's not just man, it's not just human beings, all of us who are affected by original sin, but somehow the whole creation is fallen. And that, I think, is important to keep in mind because it's, and I think, an important element of some people's acceptance of Darwinian evolution. So we begin with this awful picture of the caterpillar that has been infected by a parasitic wasp. These wasps lay their eggs inside the caterpillar. Then the larvae eat the caterpillar from within, and then they bite their way out, turn into pupa, and eventually fly away. The caterpillar dies. The reason I put this caterpillar there is because Darwin himself specifically mentioned it. In a letter to Asa Gray, he says, "With respect to the theological view of the question, this is always painful to me. I am bewildered. I had no intention to write atheistically, but I own that I cannot see as plainly as others do, as I should wish to do, evidence of design and beneficence on all sides. There seems to be too much misery in the world. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created the ichneumoniae," that's the parasitic wasp, "with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars, or that a cat should play with mice. Not believing this, I see no necessity in the belief that the eye was expressly designed." So Darwin's got a theological problem, and Cornelius Hunter in a book has argued persuasively that the most persuasive arguments for Darwinism, which go back to Darwin himself, are based on popular ideas of God. The early 19th century had inherited a tradition of rational arguments for the existence of God. There was Paley. But I think that Paley overshot his mark because he tried to argue that nature could also tell us all things about how God is beautiful and kind. And one of the things that he would say is that, well, yes, there is carnage, but usually happens quite quickly. And he tried to explain other darker aspects of nature away. But if you, I think that there is, of course, enough evidence in the world to argue for the existence of God, but to know all about redemption, we need revelation. Anyways, Darwin's contemporaries thought that they knew precisely how God should act if indeed he were wise and good. And when they looked closely at nature, they were appalled. Carnage, slow death, inefficiencies everywhere. This line of argument for evolution, which proved persuasive to many, was not based on empirical observations of natural selection in action or a continuum of fossils. Rather, it was a negative argument against God based on conviction as to what God should have done. To Darwin and his contemporaries, the only obvious alternative to evolution by natural selection was special creation by God, and the carnage, waste, and imperfections of nature functioned as arguments against this alternative. Well, what are we going to say about this? It's a difficult question, and again, it was asked really last night. I would refer people to C.S. Lewis's book on the problem of pain, where he speculates that the universe was somehow already fallen before man, and that man would have been preserved from the effects of this fall. And now that we too have fallen, we have to put up with it. One can think of nature perhaps as, if one thinks of nature as sacramental, allegorical, and we can learn something about the goodness of God from nature, we can perhaps also learn something about the spiritual battle that is going on in some of the darker things about nature. It is a good question, but it shouldn't distract us from holding on to the essential truths of the faith, original sin, and also it doesn't help in any way to buttress a Darwinian argument for how we came to be in the first place. Same kind of, remembering that we live in an imperfect, in a fallen universe can also deal with some of the questions about imperfections in nature, diseases, that kind of thing. And again, these points have been dealt with by earlier speakers, by Dr. Miller. So I won't go over them. But why did I choose to talk on evolution and original sin? Well, first of all, I think original sin is an essential teaching of the church, and I think it's really important to have a unified vision of the world, a unified vision of truth, and not to be able to walk with one part of our brain in a scientific mode and in another part in a religious mode. Never the twain shall meet. And in original sin, we encounter a historical act of disobedience, which makes it kind of interesting because science tends to be about the always and everywhere, whereas a single human action is not susceptible to the scientific method. The historical act is a good place to force into the open, I think, glib attempts to harmonize Darwinian and Catholic doctrine. People say things like science is about how and theology is about why. Catholic, and I think that we need to show that that's just much too simplistic. Darwinism and Catholic doctrine just cannot both be true. And finally, and this perhaps ties more clearly into intelligent design, is historical actions of human beings also make it clear that the world must be permeable to the actions of God and spiritual beings. And that is because God creates immediately, that means without an instrument, not by secondary means, but immediately the human soul, and then the human being, because we can choose, we can move one way or the other, we do have free will, so this universe must be designed for God's interaction with the world. It is not the closed system that people like Richard Lewontin would have us believe, who insist that we must hold on to scientific materialism in order to keep the divine foot out. I think that anybody with an open mind should recognize that the divine is at the basis of everything, and that even this fallen creation reveals the glory of God. Thank you.